I have to put in a disclaimer. But first, let me tell you that this is me talking. I'm going to introduce this story. It's meant to be the first novel in a 6 or 7 book series. The idea began in the 80s. I've given up many times over the years, and I've also taken it back up many times. I just can't seem to let it go. It's a little bit science fiction and a lot fantasy fiction. I don't read a lot anymore, but I do like to listen to audiobooks. Mostly stuff I've already read, but occasionally I'll find something I think I might be interested in and purchase it from Audible. My all-time favorite authors are C.S. Lewis, The Narnia Collection, Tolkien, Stephen Donaldson, and Stephen King. He doesn't write just horror stories. Those are just my favorites, but they are by no means the only ones I enjoy. I've read a lot of novels. Anyway, my series was sparked in the mid-80s when I was in the Air Force, stationed at Grand Forks, North Dakota. My friends and I got into the Dungeons and Dragons game. It was something to pass the time when there was nothing to do. Near the end of my term, I and 3 of my best friends came up with the idea for the story. I was designated as the writer because I could write good, little bit of humor there. After my honorable discharge from service, the story kinda went into hibernation. I had saved all I had written down in my notebooks, and kept most of it ever since. Some notes and pages got lost, but most remain in my head or on paper. Now for the disclaimer part, the main character in this story is a blacksmith. I know next to nothing about the profession. Always been interested in it, but that's as far as it goes. But I love the main character, and he's been with me for so long, and can't change his profession now. Also, the story somewhat hinges on that trade and other trades. In short, there are a lot of missing details about the smithy profession, and probably some incorrect usage of terms. Okay, so no more explanations. I'm just going to stop here and let you listen. I've included just the first 4 chapters, but there are 7 so far and more to be devised. Here is Vaynor's Doom, a novel written by Joseph Folks and read by a mysterious artificially created narrator.
Chapter 1. He was a blacksmith. Like his father and his granda, he sculpted tools, trinkets, and weapons from the unrefined metals of the earth. In his right hand was the hammer, in his left the tongs, gripping like a vice the red-hot, impure, and shapeless mass, to be transformed. Before him, as if it had grown out of the hard-packed earth, the anvil loomed, casting dark red glints and shafts of reflected light from the swelling fire of the smeltery. His father named him Elshun, and Elshun gave names to his hammer and his anvil, which had been his father's, and so on for many generations. When Elshun touched his precious smithing tools, he felt the throb of a life's blood. A vibrancy coursed throughout their sharp angles and cold curves from within. The hammer was angry and impatient, waiting in eager anticipation to strike hot metal, and so Elshun called it ire shy, which meant slow to wrath. The anvil slept patiently, dimly humming as if that was its only function, and it would not be roused no matter how many times, nor how forceful the blows from Irishai, and so Elshun called the anvil Eramor, which was the ancient word for eternity. Elshun remembered what Elan, his father, had answered when he'd told him that he had given names to the sacred smithy tools. Elan was old and infirm by then, and he was no longer able to wield the hammer with competence. No, my son, they were named long before you were born. You merely learned them because they whispered them to you. They have accepted you as their new master. Elshun looked at his father, astonished by his answer, for he was a little self-conscious about naming his tools as if they were living things. But Elshun was also surprised, because he could not remember his father saying anything quite as profound as that. Elon had always been a quiet man. He was full of action, but reserved with his words. Even now he seemed to think that nothing more needed to be said on the matter. Elshun considered telling the names to him, but then decided that the old man probably already knew them. Then there had been an unsettling darkening of his father's brow, and Elshun asked him what was wrong, but the old man would say nothing more, and the visit had been ended. Ignoring his son, Elon puffed on his pipe and turned away, lifting his cup to his lips. So Elshun left him like that. Elshun also remembered his father's words on the day he'd been bestowed with the master's apron. "Thou art now an expert blacksmith, and can learn no more from me, nor, I think, from any other smith on Vaynor," his father told him. But Elshun knew that was a deliberate exaggeration. Unless, he reflected, the old man meant that he would learn more from the daily practice of his trade than from a busy master smith who was engaged in learning himself. "Remember this, son. You will never stop learning. You will learn from the metals of the earth and from the tools and trinkets you shape and sculpt. You will learn from your own smithing tools. You will learn most from your own mistakes, and you will always make mistakes. But if you learn well and remember, you will never make the same mistake twice." It had not taken long for Elshun to relinquish the idea that to be endowed with the master's apron was to know all there was to know about the trade. On his first day alone at the smithy, now his, he had learned how wrong he was, and he would always remember his Da's words. Elshun was in his late 40s, and his wife, Shiku, in her early 30s. They had been married for 10 years, and had given up hope of having children. For this reason, Shiku was a sad, disheartened woman. But she was still beautiful in Elshun's eyes, and always able to inspire his desire for love-making, but both she and he knew there would never be any fruits for this labor. Once, Shiku suggested that he marry another who could bear him a child, if not a son, then at least a daughter who might bear him a grandson to whom he might teach to carry on the smithy profession. He had considered her proposal. She was concerned that when he died, so would die his profession, and though he knew that he was a competent smith, he also knew that there were others who were at least as competent as him. But there was no need for Shiku to worry about his profession, and he realized that this was just one of her ways of compensating. She truly believed she was barren, and that she was to blame for their not having children. Elshun was loathed to strengthen her belief by doing as she suggested, so he told her not to abandon hope, and then made passionate love to her again. At day Elshun kept busy by his smithy. Alone, except for his seemingly living companions, Irishai and Eramor, hours would go by during which he drank little and was fed only by the songs his tools clanged, hissed, or hummed at him. He would imagine a conversation with Irishai. "Patience, old fellow," he would say. "Have a care. Don't splinter the metal. It is young and soft. You are old and strong, and besides, you wouldn't want to awaken Eramor. Soft, hard, hot flesh of the earth, fire is not new to thee," the hammer would say to its prey. "But only remember, I shall remind thee, and my sleeping companion shall soften the blow." Elshun laughs heartily and asks, "What are you making, Irishai?" Let me see. For oft times, as of late, Elshun would start hammering a hunk of glowing steel without even a clue as to what it would turn out to be in the end. "And now, are not the tables turned?" Irishai would thrum in response. "Patience, man, for I am not finished." Elshun imagines a non-committal snore from the anvil. "Fowls, foe, and iron undaunted," Irishai continues. "'Tis still cold, though fire assaults it. Shall it never, ever awaken? Might as well be a very hard rock." "But no," Elshun cries. "See, Irishai, your brother dreams. See how he casts off the light of the fire. 'Tis no wonder he remains cold. Do you enter his dreams, and tell them to me. I would rather rouse the sleeping cold iron, so that he would tell thee himself." Irishai answers, as the hammer strikes the orange, glowing, shapeless mass, held fast in the tongs and resting on the anvil, showering sparks everywhere with each blow. Elshun laughs again, and continues to swing the hammer. Such sounds of frightful merriment were often heard from beyond the outer door of Elshun's smithy in the village during the day. Also was heard the sound of his bellowing voice, and it was said by the people of the village that Elshun had no need of a bellows, for his lungs sufficed to fan his smeltery fires. But although they heard him, as if he was speaking to someone, it was commonly known that he was more often than not alone, and that he had no prentice. So they speculated, not that he was a raving lunatic, but that he was somewhat eccentric. Elshun sometimes wondered, though, if he was going mad. At the end of a day, whether it be a long one or a short one, he would go home and sup with Shiku in silence. Then they would bed. Sometimes they would make love, but after he would lie awake and remember his imagined conversations with Irishai. "If I was the hammer, is that what I would say?" he would think to himself. "If I were Eramor, would I be asleep and dreaming? What would I be dreaming about?" Always he remembered his father's words. "They were named long before you were born." And again, "They were named long before—" What had his father meant, if not to suggest that the hammer and anvil were in their own way alive? They had names, and they responded to them. Or at least Irishai did. Eramor was apparently asleep and dreaming. But neither of the tools had ever spoken to him before he named them, or, as his father put it, discovered their names. And he wondered if they had spoken to his father in his own time. At last, Elshun would drift off into sleep and dream dreams filled with fiery colors. Elshun and Shiku made their home in the remnants of a village called Stone Hill, which had long ago been a thriving coastal city on the verge of becoming a metropolis which overlooked the inland Sea of Gem. In those days, the dukedom of Stonehill paid tribute to the monarchy of Latham, the largest kingdom on Vaynor. That was long ago, before the mines of Stonehill earned the name Baron. These days, Stonehill rarely produced enough revenue in a year to attract the notice of the king's taxman, and the dukedom had long since been moved to the far north in the mountain city of Palisades. Stonehill had eventually regressed back to her beginnings, a small village, barely supporting 2 blacksmiths and 1 healer. Fortunately, because of the plateaus of rich farmland overlooking the coast and quite a few skilled gardeners, Stonehill was able to maintain a meager, self-sustaining existence. The only governing entity now lived in the old fortress of the ex-Duke Lars. His name was Kos, and his title was householder, which in layman's terms meant that he was more or less an innkeeper. Kos was hale for a man in his 70s. He just wasn't skilled at any of the labors required to sustain a living in his defunct city. To his credit, he continually embarked with the fishermen on the longboats, acting as a fetchman, a job normally assigned to the young boys. Yes, he was old, but still fit. His title as householder was not one he would have chosen for himself under the circumstance in which it was thrust on him, but it was one which he was supremely qualified for. Basically, he was the village accountant. Under normal circumstances, the king's taxmen were due once a year to audit Stonehill's books. However, over 20 years had passed since the transfer of the dukedom to Palisades and Kos's new appointment as householder. He'd kept meticulous records, noting the dates the taxmen came and the amount they collected. Kos's records showed that over 20 years' time, the king's taxmen visited Stonehill no more than 8 times, and they were always somewhat less than fair in their judgment. Having been the former accountant for the previous duke, Kos was a shrewd man and had learned a few shady tricks to hide revenue from tax collectors, so both parties came out equal. Chapter 2. One morning, as Elshin and Shiku sat in silence at the break of their nightly fast, chewing the dense paratha bread Elshin regularly accepted as payment for his services, he said to Shiku, "I would be honored if you would come with me to the smithy today." She stopped chewing and looked at him with curious, uncertain eyes, and he almost recanted. He didn't know why he'd said that. He had always preferred to be alone at the smithy, while he and his associates engaged in forging a new door hinge for the householder's fortress, or whatever task needed doing. Shiku, timid as a mouse, knew his eccentricities and never worried over his state of mind. Not to his knowledge, at least. That was the problem. His wife did not show any interest in what he did for a living. "I have a surprise for you," he explained quickly. "Only I wish to know if you like it before I have the dogs lug it all the way home. It's very heavy, you know." Shiku laughed at that and seemed genuinely curious. After a moment, she nodded in assent. The absolute truth, though, was that Elshin's smithy was nearly bursting with heavy things he had forged for Shiku. Some of them he actually thought she would like, but most of them began as silver-lined epiphanies and finished up as iron-clad cooking utensils. Shiku loved to cook, but she had no lack of pots, pans, cauldrons, or flat stones. They rode in the wagon, pulled by their 3 great dogs, Rush, Lumber, and Slag, into the village and were hailed on the road by Kurun, the village's other resident blacksmith, and his apprentice. "Day of days, this is!" Kurun cried out in surprise as Elshun reined in his dogs alongside the older smith's mule-powered wagon. "I canna remember the last time I saw your beautiful wife out and in the sunlight, Elshun. Thou art looking lovely and hail, Shiku," he greeted, smiling at her. To her credit and Elshun's pride, Shiku responded gaily, "Day of days a thee as well, Master Kurun, and thee." She addressed Kurun's prentice and continued, "My husband says he has a surprise for me, and I canna wait to see it." Elshun was quick to demur, still not sure himself what his surprise was. Changing the subject, he said, "All aside, Master Kurun, where are you off to this time o' morn? This is not the road to your smithy." "I am leaving Elshun," Kurun answered bluntly. "I go to another village that is in want of a blacksmith. We stopped at your ramshackle excuse for a smoot, only you weren't there yet. so we went on hoping to catch you on your way, and so we did." Elshun, long used to Kurun's rude manner of speech, nodded in understanding, but then his features turned down. "That news saddens me, fellow Kurun," he admitted, addressing his colleague in the formal. "I ken our village is not the robust city it used to be. Yet 'twas thy presence as a competitor which partly inspired some of my more elegant drawer handles and knobs. With you and your apprentice gone, I shall grow lazy and unimaginative." Kurun laughed long, and then subsided. "Ah, Elshun, thou art a master blacksmith and craftsman, but thou dost not even realize it. You have not been challenged yet," he shouted, but with good humor. "Seriously, Elshun," Kurun continued, "you've made 3 wrong assumptions. Firstly, you ken that because I am leaving, you'll have a monopoly on the trade. Not so. And secondly, you wrongly assumed that I am taking my prentice with me. And last, I am not quitting Stonehill evermore. I intend to return when my task is done, though I know not how long 'twill be." Elshun rubbed his face with the palms of his hands, growing weary of waiting for Kurun's point. He glanced over at Shiku in exasperation, but she merely shrugged, not knowing how to respond. He looked up again and addressed Kurun's prentice. "I know you, man." He did not call him boy, because a boy he was not. He was at least 30, and had undoubtedly passed the rite of manhood. "You're Pondi's son," he started to say. "And Pondi was a cousin of mine," Kurun interjected. "My own son Cori will be running my smithy here, so ken not that you may have your way with the village Elshun. I deem that Cori is a master smith in his own right, and he needs no further instruction from me." "But is he not yet wise enough to take on your apprentice?" Elshun inquired, still unsure where all this was going. "Please don't make this more difficult than it already is," Kurun said impatiently. "Bakken is 33, older by 3 years than Cori. He cannot continue as Cori's prentice. Therefore, he must be yours." Elshun was surprised at the age difference. He had always assumed rather the reverse. He shrugged that away and asked, "What of the dower?" He indicated Bakken with a wave of his hand. "Or did you afford this prentice on your own income?" He hadn't asked out of spite or greed. He merely wanted to calculate his own expenses in taking on a prentice. And if there were a dowry, he wanted it transferred to him as any master-smith would. Kurun smiled. "You are sane and shrewd, after all," he stated. "Since Pondi died, Bakken's uncle Crowder has provided for his education and compensates me for his living expenses. You just tell him that if he wants his nephew to continue his apprenticeship, he must pay you instead." Elshun scowled. "Crowder's a healer, is he not? How can he afford the expense? The Healers' Guild of Latham does not practice the craft for profit, as well we both know. Members are provided for in the way of food, clothing, and shelter in exchange for their faithful services. They cannot demand a fee, although they may accept payment from those rich enough to give." Kurun shrugged. "I don't know," he said, "but he does not complain when he sends me payment. Perhaps he is a very good healer with very rich clients." Then he scowled impatiently. "Elshun, may we dispense with this talk? I must haste to my smoot, for I have preparations to make. Do you agree to take Bakken as your apprentice?" In his heart, Elshun had already decided. "I do," he answered. "But first, I need to know what you have taught him. How long has he been under your tutelage?" "Bakken can tell you that. He knows what I taught him, that is, if he actually learned it." At this, Kurun turned to his prentice, as if giving him permission to speak for himself. Bakken finally spoke up in defense of himself. "Of course, I learned well what you have taught me, Kurun. You are a good master, and I am a good student, but I mean no disrespect to you when I say that it would be a good learning experience for me to be under Master Elshun's tutelage for a while." Master? Elshun found himself liking the sound of that. "No doubt he will be too easy on you," Kurun said, scowling, but not really angry. "I will not allow it," Bacon argued. He disembarked from Kurun's wagon. "But tell me, Master Elshun, is it true that your hammer speaks to you?" Elshun felt his face redden in slight embarrassment, but he was quick to answer, "To me and me alone." He let it stand at that. He shot a glance at Shiku, who had remained silent and reserved during the whole conversation. She was looking at him, frowning, puzzlement darkening her features. Then Elshun looked at Kurun and said, "Well then, fellow smith, goodbye, and send word when you get to where you're going." Elshun said, "Climb on board, Bakken. We are going to my smithy." He quickly corrected. He hated when Kurun called his shop a smoot. "But we aren't going to be working today," he continued. "I'll show you and Shiku around and tell you a few things." As he urged the dogs forward, he considered the prospect of having a apprentice. The whole encounter with Kurun had been very strange and abrupt. Elshun was by no means a well-to-do blacksmith. His appetite after a long, grueling day was voracious, and Shiku barely kept his belly full. He trusted and hoped that Kurun was not misleading him into accepting another mouth to feed without compensation. He flinched inwardly, remembering a time when he was young and when he had been that extra mouth to feed, and how Ilan had given in to the demands of the local royalty in exchange for food for his family. A cold and lifeless hammer rested on the flat surface of a cold and lifeless anvil, and a steady, cold, and dim red glow emanated from the embers of a slowly dying smeltery. The door of the smithy creaked open, and shining sunlight burst through, shouldering its way past the silver-outlined figures standing in the doorway, as if to inspect the interior before allowing entrance. Elshun stood and let his eyes adjust to the dim light, looking around to make sure that everything was as he left it the night before. Bacon stood behind Elshun and peered over his shoulder, eager to see his new place of learning. He saw that it didn't look much different from Kurun's, now Corey's smith shop. "Smoot," Bacon corrected himself with a silent chuckle. Elshun escorted his wife to a low, cold stone bench and sat her down. "You are not to have any ideas about providing my workshop with your womanly touch," he admonished her lightly. She knew he was trying to lighten her mood, and looked around the dark and musty interior. "How can one improve on perfection?" she asked, with an ironic hint of a smile. Bacon had approached the hammer and anvil, and stood gaping at them with greedy, eager eyes. He looked up at Elshun. "Master Elshun, what they say is true." For a moment Elshun scowled in puzzlement. Then he remembered Bacon's curiosity about Elshun's conversations with his tools. All he could do was gape at Bacon, unsure whether he was being insulted or what. Then his brows turned down, and his countenance darkened, opting for the first. "Maybe I was wrong about you," he growled. "Maybe you aren't man enough yet to show proper respect for the trade." He advanced toward Bacon, but stopped in mid-stride. The younger man was ignoring him, not even looking at him. He was looking at the anvil. Elshun caught his breath in his throat. He stared at the great anvil which had been in his family for at least 3 generations. He once thought he'd given it a name, but his father told him he'd only learned it. He thought the anvil's function in life was to sleep and dream, whilst blow after blow of hot steel rained upon it. This was something new. All of Elshin's life he thought the anvil was alive, but sleeping an eternal sleep, and dreaming impenetrable, cold, slow, ponderous dreams. Now he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The anvil was shivering, shaking as if it was cold. He reached out and gingerly put his hand on it and felt the strong vibration, not steady, but varying in strength and becoming audible like a low rumble. Bacon lurched backward away from the anvil, afraid. Shiku stifled a small scream, but all Elshin could ken to do was try to hold the anvil still by pressing himself up against its large mass. "The ground moves, Master Elshin!" he heard Bacon shout. Then he felt the vibration in his feet and ankles growing stronger, traveling upward through his body. Frantically, he wondered if the anvil was going to crack wide open, and so he jerked his arms away from the iron contrivance, and in so doing fell to the ground on his butt. Dust and clods of dirt were raining down from the rafters, and the rumbling had increased in volume. Elshin's vision became blurred as he and everything around him began to shake. He found Shiku's horror-struck eyes. She was on her feet, her hands to her open mouth. He couldn't hear her scream of fear through the cacophony of rumbling, and then, suddenly, everything stopped moving. Shiku's scream became audible for a split second before she stifled it. Then Bacon began to cough, clearing his lungs from dust that had rained down on him. Elshin realized it was difficult for him to breathe as well, and so began to try to clear his own lungs. Only Shiku seemed untouched by the event, except for the fear which had gripped her. Finally, Elshin came arduously to his feet. His legs still remembered the feel of the ground shaking beneath them. He steadied himself by reaching out and leaning on the anvil. It seemed to continue to vibrate, and he imagined that it emitted a low hum. Or maybe, he wondered, maybe it is still, but I am not, yet. It was a quaking, he thought to himself, a tremor of the earth. He first felt the quaking long before as a lad. His granda told him that the earth felt the clash of a multitude of hammers and anvils deep in her belly, amplified as it echoed from chasms to chambers and so on, until it became so great that it made the surface above tremble and convulse, so that it sometimes cracked. Elshin remembered asking his father if Granda's story was true. Ellen answered him, "If you are to be a blacksmith, then you must take sure steps in the footprints that your fathers left for you." "Father, I understand not." "Elshin," his father said, kneeling down to face his son, "why do you doubt my father? If you doubt my father, then you must doubt me as well." Elshin nodded. "I'm sorry, father. I have dishonored you and my granda with my doubt." Yet in his heart he doubted still. Elon tousled his hair then, stood up and said amiably, "To the bellows, boy, let's heat up the forge for the householder's new door hinges." Chapter 3. Elshin quickly scanned the shop, gauging the visible damages. Shiku was still standing, with her hands to her cheeks, eyes still wide. He walked a few steps to her and took her in his arms. She was trembling slightly. She was unhurt, but shocked by the unexpected tremor. "All is well," he whispered in her ear. She hugged him and nodded and echoed his words back to him. "Yes, all is well." The whole event had lasted barely a minute. Elshin looked over at Bacon, who had also regained most of his composure during the quaking. He stood still, though, looking around as if mayhap expecting the ground to start shaking again. Elshin was reasonably sure that neither Shiku nor Bacon had ever experienced the quaking. He was only a lad of about 10 when he did, and Bacon would not have been born yet. Shiku would have been a baby. He pulled away from her and looked her in the eyes. "We must see if any of our neighbors have been harmed, and help if needed." She nodded quickly. "'Tis so," she agreed. Elshon turned to his new prentice. "Your first task, Bacon, requires no supervision from me," he announced. "Load the forge with as much fuel as you can find here. Don't overload it, and get it burning hot. We might need to make some emergency repairs." Bacon nodded, and immediately went to work. Elshon led Shiku outside. The townspeople were emerging from nearby houses, calling out to one another, mostly concerned about one another's welfare. As the once prominent city of Stonehill slowly lost its residents to surrounding villages and towns, which were growing with more economic promise, the more permanent residents moved closer to the center of the city. The closer they all lived to the householder's mansion, the better, and now no more than 500 people remained in Stonehill and its surrounds. Elshon and Shiku squinted into dusty, bright sunlight and gazed around the village. Their eyes met the fearful, concerned eyes of other villagers. Most of them were lone women, but some held infants, or were accompanied by youngsters. Most of the men were by now on the long boats in the harbor fishing. Shiku sighted a young girl coming out alone from a dilapidated old hut and ran to her. "Murla!" she called. The child turned toward her and answered, "Aunt Shiku!" They ran to meet each other, and Shiku caught the girl up in her arms. Holding Murla in her arms, Shiku began to address her neighbors. "Is anyone hurt?" she called out. "Maybe we should all check on our neighbors." Everyone began shouting at once. Elshon came to the conclusion that the event had been more frightening and confusing than harmful. Finally, Shiku got his attention. She was still holding the young girl, Murla, and he noticed the tears running down the girl's face. Shiku came close, so he could hear her. "Murla says that her grana is hurt. She fell when the ground was shaking, and then a board fell on her." Elshon nodded, and quickly strode toward the house Murla had emerged from. As he entered, he noticed that the door was hanging only by one hinge, and he wondered for how long. Of course he knew Murla and her grana Mona. Murla's mother would have been Shiku's age if she had not died in childbirth nearly 6 years ago. Murla's da, Shiku's younger brother, was living and working in Palisades at one of the underground mines. Elshon called out immediately, "Mona, where are you?" The small house was dim, curtains drawn to keep the cool air in as long as possible before the sun gained full strength. Shiku came in with Murla in her arms. Murla scrambled to get down, and she ran to a pile of rubble. A large cupboard had shaken loose from the wall and had apparently collapsed on the woman. A low, painful moan escaped the pile. "Grana, I brought help," Murla exclaimed. Elshon knelt down before the old woman. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he made out that most of Mona had escaped the cupboard, but a lot of its contents had surely left some bruises on her arms and upper torso, and one broken jar lay by her head. He didn't see any marks on her head, but it was difficult to tell. He turned to Shiku. "We could do with a little light in here," he said. She understood, and began opening the curtains. The board that had fallen on Mona was one of the upright beams which supported the roof. It had come down almost directly on her kneecap. As strong as Elshon was, even he had some difficulty gently lifting the beam up and away from Mona's leg. At first, the leg looked normal, as if something nearby had deflected the full weight of the beam. But moments later, they watched the knee swell to 4 times its size, and he knew it had received the full force of the blow. At this point, Elshun was at a loss of how to proceed. He was not a healer. Crowder was the only healer in the village. But he didn't actually live in the village, he lived on the shore. He believed that the sea contained the seeds of life and health, and so, as a daily ritual, he combed the beach for nearly 2 miles north and south, seeking and gathering Vaynor's gifts from her ocean. Shiku was again at his side. She looked at the old woman's injury, then looked up at Elshun. "Husband, you must take the wagon and find the healer," she commanded in earnest. "Murla and I will care for Mona until you return." Elshun nodded, thinking that Crowder would have felt the quaking and would already be on his way. Even if he was, Elshun could not accomplish anything by sitting on his hands, waiting. Shiku had a touch of healing power in her, and Murla would be a comforting presence for Mona when she woke. He stood and spoke his thoughts. "Crowder has likely already been sent for. Nevertheless, mayhap I can speed him on his way with the help of the dogs." He turned toward the door and once more noticed the top hinge securely in place, but the bottom one barely holding with one screw. His Da once told him that the salty sea air caused the metal to rust and disintegrate rapidly, and that he would constantly be replacing hinges, especially because they consisted of 2 pieces of metal opposing one another. He couldn't believe he'd been so negligent in recent years. Elan would never have allowed his own work to fall to such ruin. There were oils and desiccants one could apply which would greatly reduce the rapidity of wear and corrosion. His Da taught him about those as well, but apparently he'd thought that the lesson was unimportant. Shaking his head, and disgusted with himself, he looked down in time to see an elderly woman poke her head in the opening. He gave his attention to the newcomer. "Master Elshun," she addressed, "dost thou need any assistance?" She went on before he could answer. "All seems to be well on this street, besides a lot of agitated young women and children. I saw you and your wife with young Murla come in here. Is Mona all right?" Elshun did a double take. "Rianne!" he exclaimed in amazement. "I thought you had gone." He could hardly believe his eyes. She was Rianne, the youngest daughter of Duke Lars of Stonehill, who had died some time after the seat had been moved to Palisades. Because of ill health, Lars had voluntarily relinquished the title of Duke, so that he could live out his final days in Stonehill. Elshun remembered Rianne as a young woman from his boyhood. She must be nearly 60 now. She had stayed in Stonehill with her new husband after her father died. They raised 2 children together, both of whom were now living in Palisades as far as Elshun knew. Nearly a year passed. Rianne's husband, Vand, died unexpectedly in slumber, and she decided to leave the village to be with her eldest son and his family. Vand was around 15 years Elshun's senior, but they got along like brothers. Vand was a plough-master, and frequently called on Elshun to repair the harrow, or forge anew the bull-tongue, or countless menial smithy-type tasks. Vand also enjoyed observing and helping Elshun perform these tasks, until a year ago when he died in his sleep. Elshun discussed an idea he'd had with Shiku, and they offered to take in Rianne, if for naught else, than to keep a company with one another. But Rianne had refused. She wanted to get to know the children of her children and make sure they learned their heritage properly. "What brings you back to the hill?" Elshun inquired. Then he continued before she could answer, "Did you forget your flute?" She scowled at him. "If all is well here, then I'll go on my way, Master Elshun." Why I'm here now is another matter which can wait afore we discuss it." She looked over at Shiku, still kneeling with Murla at Mona's side. Then she groaned softly when her eyes found Mona, and they began filling with tears. Hastily, Elshun explained what had happened and his plan to get help, then needlessly added, "Please stay with them, Rian," as he turned and left the house. He went first back to his smithy to check on Bacon and give him some new instructions. Bacon barely had time to load the forge and had just struck a spark to his kindling when Elshun burst in again. "Prentice Bacon," he began, "it seems naught except one close by has been hurt, and she is being tended to, but she needs a healer. I must find thy uncle and hopefully speed him on his way. While I'm gone, I want you to find some new hinges in my stores and get the door at Mona's house operational. Then be it so you inspect as many of the rest of the houses nearby as you can, and I mean not just the ironworks. The quaking may have been much stronger and more damaging elsewhere than here. Enlist any young, strong men you can find, and if you have to, use Kurun's name as your authority." "Should I light the fire or not, Master Elshun?" Bacon inquired. His first spark of the flint had gone astray. Elshun noted the amount of fuel Bacon had stacked in the forge basin. 'Twas a good amount to let sit and smolder whilst he set about his new task. So he nodded assent, but explained that he should just have it at the ready should the need arise for emergency ironworks. Then Elshun remembered that Kurun would probably still be at his smoot if he had felt the quaking. "Get Master Kurun to help you." He wondered if Kurun had finished the preparations for his journey and started on the road before the quaking. Mayhap he had felt it for himself and turned back to give aid. As he pondered these thoughts, Elshun's eyes found and rested on Irishai the hammer, and he suddenly felt a cold, gloomy spirit take hold of him, and he shivered. "What is amiss, Master Elshun?" Bacon was still looking at him with an odd, concerned expression. Elshun sighed. "It is naught." But it wasn't. Something had changed in their lives, and he felt afraid it wasn't for the better. He remembered a verse from an old poem his granda once recited to him. "Every grain of sand must fall in its time. We are grains of sand, and until we fall, there is no change." He'd been too young then to understand what it meant, but he learned over the years. Surely it meant that death is merely a transition to a new, changed life. But that memory did not explain his sense of impending wrongness. He shrugged the feeling off as best he could and said to Bacon, "I must hasten." And he went out of the smithy. Closing the door behind him, Elshun looked toward his wagon. He saw that the dogs, who were still harnessed to the wagon, had taken to lounging restfully on their bellies. They were still alert, and their eyes followed him as he climbed to the perch box, sat, and gave the command to rise. Immediately they were on their feet. He gave another command, and they were off, wending their way down the main street of the village, heading generally Ewar and Dowar along the gentle sloping road which eventually led to the seashore. He bade the dogs increase their pace as they approached the final outskirts of the village. They now saw no one as they passed the last dilapidated house of the old part of the village, abandoned long before. Soon after, they came to the perilous drop, where the road began a series of switchbacks, sidewinding back and forth down the face of the promontory until it eased into about a mile more of gentle hillocks before the grassland finally gave way to beach sand and shore. Elshon halted the dogs here. He still felt that fearful uneasiness that gripped him at his shop. According to his vague calculations, the quaking had occurred not much less than an hour ago. He wanted to believe it had been felt at least as far away as the beach, but he supposed it was possible that it had not. If not, then 'twould account for Crowder's persistent absence on the road before him. Elshon had a clear view of most of the road which sloped away from him, and there was no one upon it. Surely Crowder could not have gained the village without passing him. There were other roads, but they meandered northwest and southwest to farmlands before turning back to War Stonehill. Still, there was that mile of road between the bottom of the bluff and the beach, and Elshon's eyes were not large enough to encompass what lay so far distant. He could see distant sparkling glints of reflected sunlight off the rippling waves of the Sea of Gem. But his view of the beach from here was blurred by mist and blotted by hills. He cursed the day which had started out so pleasant even with the proclamation from Curran that it was a day of days, an old-fashioned greeting rarely used since the decline of Stonehill. He grunted and urged the dogs forward. Their descent was slow. The dogs were sure-footed and confident, but Elshon still remembered the vibrations of the quaking which had thrown more than a few people off their feet. Also, he'd heard of aftershocks, less severe and diminishing echoes of the first, but still hazardous. He wanted to reach the bottom, in a manner that didn't involve being hurled over the edge of the road, wagon and all, and reaching the bottom by air rather than the remaining switchbacks. Finally, they reached the point where the snaky curves of the road stopped nearly doubling back on themselves, and started stretching further and further away from the cliff wall, and soon they were traveling over the grassy hillocks Elshon had seen from above. His mind was eased somewhat, simply because if he fell now, the short distance to the ground would not kill him. Nevertheless, he was growing more and more ill at ease. For instance, it was too quiet. Granted, he rarely traveled this road. He was used to hearing the mixed cacophony of his neighbors gossiping and their children arguing, and his bellows squealing, and his roaring fire and hissing steam and loud clanging from Irishai. The dogs did not seem discomfited by the silence, and he envied their lack of imagination, for he was sure his uneasiness was due to the quaking and all the old ghost stories he'd listened to as a youngster. They reached the crest of a hillock, and were treated to the sight of the whole shoreline, north to south of the Sea of Gem. Elshon momentarily forgot what he was about, his sense of urgency having crept away from him whilst they were still descending the cliff. Then he caught sight of Crowder's bungalow, and quickly spurred his engines in that direction. The healer's hut stood about 20 yards inland from high tide point, amidst a jumble of mossy lavished boulders and dried seaweed and washed-up driftwood. Elshon did not expect Crowder to be about, but perhaps householder Coss would be there and could tell him where to find the elusive healer. He also noted the empty beach, devoid of toiling fishermen and their eldest sons. He scowled. He'd not heard news that the fishermen had moved their operation, but then again he kept to himself and Shiku most of the time and paid little heed to what his neighbors were doing. Rush, the lead dog, halted a few paces from an old, unusable raft that served as a front porch for Crowder's place of residence. Elshon unlashed himself from the perch box and hopped to the ground. "Master Healer," he called. "Crowder, are you about?" There was no answer. "Is anyone about?" he shouted. The quiet was almost audible. "Where on Vaynor is everybody?" Elshon wondered aloud. He walked up to the rickety door, hung in place by hinges that his granda might have made, or Kurun's granda. Just then the door swung slowly open on its own with a long, low squeak. Slightly startled, Elshon stepped back a step and glanced at the dogs to see if their hackles were raised, but they sat on their haunches, looking bored. He looked again at the obscure darkness inside the hut. "Hello?" he began. But he stopped there. Elshon decided to sheol with caution, grunted another curse, and strode boldly into the gloom. Nothing jumped out at him, no one shouted in alarm. His eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light. A look around proved fruitless. As a matter of fact, it looked as if the place had been as long abandoned as some of the other houses in the old Stonehill. He wondered how long it had been since he'd actually seen the healer. He'd also recently learned from Kurun that Crowder was Bakin's uncle, and was paying a dowry to Kurun to prentice him. Supposedly, Crowder should now be paying Elshon, but Elshon was beginning to wonder if he'd ever see Crowder again. He wasn't worried about compensation. He would not have told him this, but he'd always envied Kurun, his son, and his prentice. Elshon had none. Even though Shiku had urged him to take a concubine, he laughed at the thought, as if he was royalty who had his pick of the ladies. Anyway, Bacon was a welcome boon to Elshon and his smithy, and dowry or none, he was going to accept him as his prentice. The only thing that struck him as odd was that, according to Kurun, Bacon was 3 years older than Cory. He had always thought them the same age, not that it made a difference to him. Chapter 4. Elshon took hold of the present again. He was supposed to be finding Crowder and bringing the healer to the village, and more specifically to Mona's. But the healer wasn't here, nor was there anyone else around. Just to make sure, he turned around and left the hut. Rush, slag, and lumber were on their haunches, patiently waiting for orders, and the beach, as far as he could see, still devoid of human life. 2 miles to the south, he knew, the shore began a slow arc inland, and at that point became rocky and devoid of beach. The breakers hurled a continuous frothy mix of mist and ocean spray meters into the air, creating a veil that blotted out clear vision of what lay further south, either a sea or a shore. To the north, distance was the only obstruction to his vision, and he saw no signs of life that way. Seawar, he knew, 2 islets dipped just 'neath the horizon, where fishermen were accustomed to luncheon if the weather permitted. The hour for lunch, though, was still 2 shadows nigh. Normally, this time of the morn, there should be long boats lining the shore, and youngsters cleaning and wrapping the early catch, and arguing or fighting with another for the honor of their fathers. Even householder Koss might be about, for this was one of his favorite pastimes. There would be boats continually cutting the waves to and fro, and men standing in them, casting their nets, port or star. But there was no one about. The quiet and emptiness of the beach made Elshon shiver. He was grateful for the company his dogs provided. His course was clear, though, and he didn't like it. He had to follow the shoreline south and gain the stretch of rocky beach so he could have a clear view of what lay beyond. He went and unhitched the dogs from the wagon. It didn't travel easily through wet beach sand. Even he didn't do well just walking on beach sand. And he stayed well away from the encroaching waves. The dogs were glad to be free of the wagon, and they sprang down the beach, sowar, as if they had known before Elshon that it was their predestined course. They also had a romp in the water to cool off. Elshun followed their lead unconcernedly. He may as well. After all, when he was on the wagon, they were in the lead. His pace was straight and brisk, but the dogs always kept a pace, no matter how many times they darted off to investigate some new curiosity. Elshun didn't like the sea. Looking straight out over the waves from the beach made him giddy. He had never been on a longboat, but when he was very little, just a babe, he'd accompanied his mother and father on a galleon. Stonehill was suffering the economic collapse, and Elan, like most of the men who were only skilled as miners or smiths, booked passage for himself and his family to sail north to Palisades. But the arduous journey had been in vain, for by the time they arrived, Palisades already had the largest concentration of smiths in Latham. The city, which had begun as a military outpost, also had new technology for mass-producing weapons of iron and steel. In short, the kingdom had no need for more smiths, especially those who were untrained in the new technologies. Elan was born and raised in an era when smiths were still akin to healers, both revered as essential craftsmen to the communities they inhabited. These days, it seemed there was no want of them anywhere. Anywhere but the widely spaced communities that lay far off the beaten path. Communities that needed iron masters to forge new cauldrons, hinges, and horseshoes, rather than swords, cannonballs, or crossbow bolts. Elan could shape a battle sword as well as the best of smiths. But if there weren't enough swords already, there soon would be. The Duke of Palisades wanted smiths drafted into the king's army, or rather, that's what the king wanted. They wanted anyone with a skill that could be used to their advantage under their control. Any trained smith who refused to service themselves to the king would not be allowed to perform their trade independently in Palisades. Since Elan had been informed that they already had enough smiths in the king's service, his only choice was to opt for a new profession or leave the city. So he opted to take his family back to Stonehill, where his father still lived on the twilight side of life, where he could have the chance to teach his son how to forge the ultimate door hinge, and where he knew that the iron ore mines were not as dry as were widely thought. Elan confided all that to Elshun when he was old enough to comprehend. For Elan had known, after that initial voyage, that his son was by no means destined for a life on the water, for the boy-babe had taken ill and fussed continuously. They had covered a mile, Elshun being lost in thought, but still keeping a watchful eye on the dogs, when a distant shout started the dogs barking. Out to sea, about 100 yards away, was a man standing on the water. Elshun had to peer closely to make sure this wasn't some illusion caused by the sunlight's reflection on the water. The man seemed to rise and fall on the waves, and Elshun finally realized he was riding the waves atop a wooden plank, crouched and with arms outstretched for balance. The man's approach was swift, and the dogs ran out to meet him as his plank grew still in the sand and he stepped off. He knelt smoothly, picked up the board, and tucked it under his arm. Elshun had never seen anything like it. It wasn't just a wooden plank. It was smoothly finished, rounded to a point on one end and cut flat on the other. That end had a sort of rudder or fin fixed to the underside. Elshun supposed it helped keep the board from flipping over in the water. The stranger greeted the sniffs of the dogs with politeness, being careful not to make any threatening moves. Elshun did not know this man. He was dressed only in a loincloth. His hair was nearly white and flowed nearly to his waist. His skin was deeply browned and wrinkled by long exposure to the sun, but he did not look old to Elshon. He decided the old formal greeting was best suited to this meeting. "Day of days, this is to meet a newcomer to my—" He paused and looked over the lonely beach to the outskirts of my village. He finished with a symbolic circle drawn around his chest with his thumb. The stranger laughed and repeated the greeting back, then said, "Elshon, know me ye not? For certainly do I remember you." Elshon scowled. Obviously, he did know this young man whose skin had been browned and wrinkled by overexposure to the sun, but time and separation had made him unfamiliar. He spoke impatiently. "Well, do not make me guess. If thou knowest me, then thou also knows I do not frequent the seashore. So tell me who you are, man." The younger man looked abashed, and said, "I'm sorry, Master Elshon. I am Michal. When I was young, you and your father would come to my father's farm, and set up your ironworks and forge anew our broken and worn tack. My father was Malik." Remembrance came slowly to Elshon, for many years and many things passed since those days. It was Michal's name that brought the past to life for him. Elshon, understandably, could never keep Malik and Michal straight. Their visits to Malik's farm were infrequent and few before Elan became unable to, and Kurun took over the task. What Elshon mostly remembered was that Michal was enamored with him and looked up to him as an older brother. He tried to remember the occasion of their last meeting, and could not be exact. For one thing, Michal's hair had not been white and long, nor had his skin been so wrinkled the last time they had encountered one another. He wondered how much he himself had changed in Michal's eyes. Evidently not much, since Michal knew him at once, even from far out to sea. Then of a sudden, it did come to him the last time he'd seen Michal. It was at the gathering to remember and honor the life of Malik just after he'd gone to meet the Melasha. Elshon had gone with Elan, but he'd felt like an intruder, and did not know what to say, so he'd kept his distance from Malik's immediate family. That was at least 15 years ago. Now that his memory had caught up, Elshon found some appropriate words. They flooded out of him. "Where is everyone?" he demanded. "There's been an earthquake on the plateau, and a woman has been injured. I came to fetch the healer, Crowder. I expected to find the beach full of fishermen and Crowder somewhere among them. Instead, I find a deserted beach, a deserted hut, a deserted sea." Elshon paused for breath. He indicated Michal's waterboard. "And I am accosted by you as if you were some sea god who can command the waves to bear you up." Michal interrupted. "Master Elshon, Crowder and the fishermen and their sons are just beyond the breakers, Sawar, attempting to free a sea monster that has become beached." Michal's fearful excitement was at last visible to Elshon. The younger man continued, "The elders say it was carried into the shallows by the unusual tidal waves earlier the morn, and trapped twixt the sea and shore by the reef. Then the tide kept pushing it further up the beach. Master Elshon, it is a behemoth." Michal drew in a breath and continued, "That is why the beach is deserted. I was going to get more help from my neighbors on the plateau, but since you need Crowder, I will go and send him to you if you will send men from the farms with spades and wheelbarrows. We are attempting to dig a trench to the sea big enough for the monster." Elshon agreed. He would have liked to gaze at such a creature, but did not relish an arduous climb over the rocky knoll where the beach ended and the breakers began. He was too close to the sea as it was. He didn't want to be overcome by vertigo and fall into it. He said that he and the dogs would go back to Crowder's hut and wait for him there, and Mikal nodded. Then they shook hands and parted company. Mikal, like a sure-footed goat, bounded from one boulder to another. At one point he stopped and tossed his water-board over the crest of the hill, then bounded after it. When he disappeared over the apex, Elshon turned around and began a reasonable trot for a man his age, and whistled for the dogs to follow. In quick time they reached the wagon and the hut. Elshon dug around in his stowaway trunk for some water flasks and dried meat for himself and the dogs. He doubled their portion because they had worked twice as hard so far today than during their normal routine. Not that their portions would completely satisfy their never-full bellies. Only Shiku could satisfy these dogs' appetites with her cooking. Elshon often accused her in jest of spoiling them, but he was prone to offer them handouts when she wasn't looking. Spoiled or not, they remained faithful, obedient, and alert. After their food, he let them drink their fill of water, which did not quite deplete his supply. There was enough left for a dire emergency. He wasn't worried, though, because they were less than 2 hours away from a young well, and now that the mystery of the missing healer and fisherman had been explained by Mikal, his spirits were uplifted. He just didn't like the thought of old Mona up there in agony over her broken knee and whatever else she may have suffered. After the dogs were hitched back to the wagon, Elshon glanced down the beach and saw someone jogging his way. 'Twas Crowder. The healer was only about 10 years older than Elshon, but seemed ancient. Life on the beach wrinkled the skin, it seemed, and the salty sea and sun-bleached the hair. Crowder need not worry about that, for he had none. So he wore a turban to keep from burning the top of his head. The healer greeted Elshon with a bow. "Day of days, Master Elshon. Mikal tells me I am needed in the village?" "Indeed, this is a day of days," Elshon responded. "Master Crowder, did anyone down here feel the quaking?" Crowder nodded. "I, for one, but it only lasted 15 seconds. In Stonehill proper it was more than that, but less than a minute," Elshon replied. "There was minor structural damage. Old Mona fell, and then a support pole collapsed on her leg, probably broke her kneecap. I fear too much time has passed trying to find you. In all truth, I believed I would meet you on the road already on the way." Before Elshon finished, Crowder was already going into his hut. He called back over his shoulder, "I just need to grab my bag and some herbs." 5 minutes later, Crowder sat next to Elshon on the wagon's perch box. They'd already covered a fair distance back toward the village when Elshon thought to ask, "Were any of our sea hunters hurt in the quaking?" Crowder looked at him and smiled. "You must have seen Mikal riding the surf on that board." Elshon nodded. "Yes. I thought it was some sea god at first, walking on the water." Crowder laughed. "There has been no fishing this day, Master Elshon. Mikal, a farmer's boy, has learned how to catch the waves and put a harness on them, as they have begun to say." "How long has he been coming down here and riding that board?" Elshon asked. "Does he no longer work his land?" Crowder shrugged. "I think he is weaning himself from the farming life. He started coming here after his da passed. At first he played fetchman for the fishermen, then he prenticed into the league and became quite the fisherman. But Master Elshon, Michal is multifaceted. He wants to learn more than just one trade. He might even have the intellect of a healer, for he has aided me on many occasions in stitching up cuts or mending broken bones. Anyway, about a year and a half ago, Michal discovered that he could balance himself on a board in motion as on a rolling wave and ride the wave to shore. He was ecstatic. Since then, he has gathered a sort of following. They have learned to carve their own boards out of the balsam tree trunk, which is lightweight, but strong and extremely buoyant. Elshon said, "That is awesome indeed. But if the fishermen are not fishing, then what are they feeding to their families?" Crowder looked at him and frowned. "Do you envy their accomplishment?" Elshon only shrugged and asked again, "Was there anyone injured when the waves came?" "Two, but they are hale now, because I practiced my art on them, and they were healed." "Let us hope it's not too late for Mona," Elshon said, looking ahead. They rode in silence for a while. Then Crowder said, "The quaking began offshore, and was the cause of the tidal waves." Elshon thought about this and nodded. Crowder continued, "It was a baby quaking. 'Twas a blessing of the Melasha that the fishermen were on shore watching the younger men and boys ride their boards. If it had been stronger, like you and I have seen in the ago days, it could have been a disaster, but to them it was just a bigger thrill." Elshon said, "So how badly injured were the two?" Annoyed with Elshon's line of questioning, Crowder blurted, "Elshon, they live and are hale. You don't need to know how badly they were hurt." Elshon turned his eyes ahead then, and they did not converse again until they pulled up in front of Mona's house. However, before then, they were accosted several times upon entering the village with greetings and questions, which Crowder answered with his own standard greeting and no worries. Husbands and sons were all well and engaged with their work. And any time Elshon saw someone he knew to have a swift mode of transportation, he told them of Michal's request for spades and wheelbarrows, and he bade them pass the news on. After disembarking, Elshon led the way into Mona's house, stopping momentarily to inspect Bakin's hinge repair. Shiku was still sitting with Mona. Murla knelt by Shiku with her head in Shiku's lap, apparently asleep. A glance around the one-room house told Elshon that Rian was not present. Crowder brushed past him and went to Mona. The old woman seemed to be sleeping peacefully. Elshon knelt beside Shiku and watched as Crowder removed the dressing that Rian had applied to Mona's knee. The swelling had lessened considerably. There was a long gash where the rough-hewn wood of the beam had torn her skin, and it oozed blood. Crowder looked at Shiku and asked, "Did you dress this wound? This appears to be the work of a healer."